Please, please let me go, the young woman begged, her voice trembling with fear, as her body was pinned to the cold concrete. Her hands trembled as she begged for mercy, desperate to escape the hell unfolding before her. But Mason Collins, the man sworn to protect, ignored every word. His grip tightened, his eyes cold and emotionless as he carried out his brutal act, his uniform only making the horror worse. Please, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm begging you, she cried, her voice barely a whisper now, broken by sobs. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The cop's hands moved with grim precision, and in that moment her humanity meant nothing. His every movement was filled with hatred, but she kept fighting, kept pleading. She was desperate for her life, but the pain was too much. Her strength faltered, her voice silenced as the last breath escaped her lips. When the deed was done, Collins stood over her lifeless body, emotionless, cold, as if her life had never mattered. And when Jamal Carter, her older brother, received the call, the world stopped turning. His baby sister was gone, not by accident but by the hands of a man meant to uphold the law. The rage that burned within him was too fierce to control. She had begged for her life, and he would make sure her killer would beg for his. The hunt for justice had begun, and it would be relentless. Jamal Carter sat in the quiet warmth of his living room, his sister, Brianna, curled up beside him on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched an old comedy movie they used to laugh at as kids. Her giggle, soft and carefree, was a sound that always filled Jamal's heart with warmth, no matter how hard the world around him became. It was a sound of normalcy, of the life they had fought to build in a world that was too often unforgiving to people like them. Brianna had always been his rock, the one who kept him grounded through the hardest times. When their mother passed away, it was Brianna who had held their family together, who made sure they had dinner every night and their house was filled with laughter, despite the sorrow that clung to them. Jamal worked long hours as a mechanic, doing everything he could to make a good living, but it was Brianna who made their home feel like a place of peace. She was his best friend, his sister, his family. That night they shared the simple joy of being together, of doing nothing but laugh and talk. Jamal teased her about how she could still recite the movie lines word for word, despite the fact they had seen it 1,000 times. Brianna, with a mock frown, pushed him away, playfully calling him a dork. It was these quiet, simple moments that made the chaos of the world bearable because they had each other. Their father had died when Jamal was just a teenager, and their mother's passing left a hole that neither of them knew how to fill. But they had each other, and that was enough. Every evening was a small ritual of catching up on the day, cooking dinner together, and sitting down to watch a show or talk about their dreams for the future. Jamal dreamed of one day opening his own auto shop, where he could work for himself and be his own boss. Brianna, ever the dreamer, talked about moving to a bigger city, exploring the world beyond their little neighborhood. It was the kind of life they had come to cherish, simple, steady, and full of love. Despite the hardships, they had carved out a space for themselves, a space where they mattered, where they belonged. For Jamal, that was enough. All he needed was his family, and everything else could wait. But as Brianna's laughter echoed through the living room, Jamal couldn't help but wonder how long they could hold on to this fragile peace. He had seen enough of the world to know that nothing lasts forever, especially for people like them, black working class, too often overlooked, too often treated like they didn't matter. Still, in this moment, Jamal refused to let those thoughts in. For tonight, he allowed himself the luxury of thinking that they could be safe, that nothing could tear them apart. And then, the phone call came. That was his neighbor, Mrs. Thomas, her voice shaking as she told him that Brianna had been in trouble. Jamal's heart stopped, the warmth of the room suddenly turning cold as a chill crept down his spine. He didn't know what was happening, but the way Mrs. Thomas spoke it was enough to make Jamal's stomach churn. Jamal, honey, you need to come to the alley off Maple Street. The police, ... They've found Brianna. His breath hitched. What do you mean found? He demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't understand. Brianna had been with him just moments ago, her laughter still in his ears. How could she be in trouble? But the words that followed were the ones that changed his world forever. Brianna had been found dead, violently taken from him by the hands of someone who had sworn an oath to protect and serve. Jamal's mind couldn't process it. His body felt numb, like it was disconnected from the world around him. His sister, his best friend, gone, taken. His legs buckled under him as the weight of the news slammed into him like a freight train. His vision blurred, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He had lived his entire life in a constant state of fear of what the world could do to him, to his family. But he never imagined it could take Brianna to not like this. As he stumbled out of his apartment, his chest heaving, Jamal's mind raced with images of her smile, her laughter, his sister, the girl who had been there through thick and thin, who had shared every joy and every sorrow with him. She had never hurt anyone, never deserved this fate. And yet, her life was now reduced to a news headline, to another black body found lifeless, discarded like garbage on a cold street. Jamal's eyes burned with unshed tears as he thought about the life they had built, the life he had wanted to protect, to nurture. His entire world was shattering in front of him, and all he could do was stand there, consumed by grief and rage. He had always told Brianna that no matter what happened, he would protect her, but in the end, it was the world that had failed her. The system that was supposed to keep them safe had only taken away what mattered most. And now, with nothing but the haunting sound of her last words in his mind, Jamal knew that he couldn't let this go. The peaceful life he had once cherished was gone forever. In its place stood only the fire of vengeance, burning in his chest, demanding to be unleashed. The world would hear Brianna's name, and Mason Collins, the man who had taken her, would pay. The morning after Brianna's death, the sun rose like a cruel mockery of the world Jamal once knew. He barely noticed the light streaming through the cracked blinds of his apartment, too numb to care about anything but the deafening silence that now filled the spaces around him. His world had been torn apart in one heartbeat, and no matter how much he tried to grasp at the shreds of his life, it slipped through his fingers like sand. Jamal barely slept that night, his mind replaying the sound of Brianna's laughter, her words, her smile. But it all came crashing down when he thought about how she had been taken from him, how the man who had done it was someone who wore a badge, someone who was supposed to be there to protect her, not destroy her. Mason Collins was supposed to be a hero, but in the eyes of the world, he had become nothing more than a villain. And Jamal couldn't escape the haunting thought. How many others had he hurt in the same way? It wasn't long before Jamal began hearing whispers, silent conversations he couldn't avoid. They started as rumors, fragments of gossip among people in the neighborhood who were too scared to speak up but couldn't hold their tongues any longer. He heard that Collins had a reputation for harassing people, especially black men and women. No one had ever dared to confront him. His position in the force gave him power, and with power came a dangerous sense of invincibility. And now, Brianna had been his latest victim. Jamal felt the weight of this knowledge like a hammer on his chest. He had heard of police brutality, seen the videos, read the stories, but somehow, it had always felt like something distant, like a nightmare that happened to someone else, somewhere else. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined that the nightmare would come crashing down on his family, on his sister. Brianna had been a victim of a system that was supposed to protect her, a system that allowed men like Collins to act with impunity. But as the days dragged on and Jamal sought answers, his anger only grew. The more he learned about Collins, the more he saw the twisted nature of the man behind the badge. Collins wasn't just a cop, he was a predator. He used his power to exploit, to destroy, to take lives without consequence. Brianna was just the latest in a long line of victims who had been silenced, who had been erased from the world. It wasn't long before Jamal began noticing the subtle changes in the way people looked at him, the way they treated him now that Brianna was gone. The sympathy in their eyes was palpable, but it didn't bring his sister back. It only reminded him of the injustice that had been done. People started talking about the case, but they weren't talking about the fact that Brianna had been murdered. They were talking about how it was just another case of a black person caught in the crossfire of a system that was broken beyond repair. And then there was the moment that pushed Jamal past the point of no return. That happened when he was speaking to one of the officers at the precinct. He had hoped for some sign of justice, some shred of hope that the system would take his sister's case seriously, but the officer's dismissive attitude spoke volumes. He watched as the officer acted as if it was just another routine death, another statistic to be filed away in the endless paperwork of police brutality. The officer didn't even look him in the eye when he gave him the cold, standard line. "We're investigating the situation, sir. Please be patient." Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, and his heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make the officer understand the gravity of what had happened. But as he looked around, he saw the same apathetic faces, officers who had long ago lost their humanity, who viewed people like him as expendable. It was then that Jamal realized Brianna's death would never be fully acknowledged by the people who had taken an oath to protect her. The system wasn't built to care about people like them. The following night, as he lay in bed, his thoughts still clouded by grief and rage, Jamal couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that justice would never be served. The protests, the news reports, The outrage, none of it mattered when the very people who were supposed to protect the truth were the ones hiding it. There was no way for him to find peace within the confines of a system that was designed to uphold the status quo, to silence the cries of those who suffered at its hands. Jamal's mind wandered back to Collins. Every moment he thought about the man, the more the anger burned. He had seen what Collins had done. He had felt the sting of injustice in his gut. Jamal couldn't just sit back and wait for the justice that would never come. His sister deserved more. He deserved more. The tipping point came one evening when Jamal caught a glimpse of Mason Collins. The officer was sitting in his squad car outside a local diner, looking like the king of his own little world. He didn't even flinch when Jamal's eyes locked onto him. Collins didn't see him as a man who had just lost his sister, didn't see him as someone grieving the most painful loss he could imagine. To Collins, Jamal was just another black man, unimportant, forgettable, beneath him. That's when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place for Jamal. He realized that nothing would change unless he forced it to. He had been holding on to hope that the system would somehow right itself, that someone would step in and bring Collins to justice. But the truth was, Collins didn't fear the law. He didn't fear the public outcry. He was untouchable, and that's when Jamal knew. There would be no peace for him until Mason Collins was brought to his knees. The stage had been set, and there would be no going back. Jamal's quest for justice was about to become something much darker, more personal, and far more dangerous. The loss of Brianna would not be in vain. The pain would be transformed into something that could no longer be ignored. Jamal wasn't just going to make them hear his sister's name. He was going to make them feel the weight of what they had taken from him. Jamal couldn't sleep. He hadn't been able to sleep properly since that night, since Brianna's death shattered everything he knew about safety, justice, and family. The darkness that had once been just the absence of light had become something else, something suffocating. It pressed against his chest, curling around him like a thick fog, weighing him down with its grief, its fury, and its hopelessness. His mind never stopped, never allowed him a moment of peace. There was always a face in his thoughts. His sister's, twisted in terror, screaming for help that never came. And then there was his own face, in the mirror, eyes red and hollow, filled with a pain he couldn't escape. The funeral was a blur. Jamal couldn't remember half of it, his body moving like it wasn't his, as if the grief had taken hold of him completely. He had to hold it together, had to be strong for his family, for his mother, who cried quietly in the corner, as if her entire world had crumbled with Brianna. He didn't have the luxury of breaking down in front of anyone, of letting his despair spill over for all to see. No, he had to be a pillar, even if every bone in his body was screaming at him to fall apart. But the truth was, Jamal was falling apart. The anger was there, coiling tight in his gut, but so was the confusion. How could this happen? How could a police officer, a man sworn to protect people, do this to his sister? Jamal couldn't reconcile the two versions of the world he had been shown, the one where cops were supposed to keep people safe, and the one where Brianna had been killed by the very system meant to protect her. How had this happened? Was this the price of being black in America? Was this his sister's fate simply because of who she was? The questions consumed him, twisted inside his mind, tangled with the raw grief that threatened to suffocate him every waking moment. He would go to bed at night, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, not knowing where to go, what to do, how to start. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't just let her death be another statistic. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The first few days after the funeral, Jamal tried to reach out to people, neighbors, friends, even the lawyer who had promised to bring justice, but every conversation left him feeling emptier. The system, he realized, wasn't interested in justice. It wasn't even interested in finding out what happened to Brianna. He knew it, deep in his gut, because nothing was moving fast enough. There were no answers, no urgency, just the same old song and dance of "we're investigating," while his sister's body was buried 6 feet under. He tried to focus on the details of what he had learned about Collins, the cop who had done this, the man who had taken Brianna. From him he knew that the system was corrupt, knew that the badge Collins wore was a shield that protected him from the consequences of his actions. But the more Jamal learned, the more powerless he felt. He couldn't fight the system. How could one man stand up against an institution that had been built to crush people like him, people like Brianna? Each time he thought about the power Collins wielded, Jamal's hands balled into fists. But he felt small, insignificant in the face of it. What was he supposed to do? Was there any way he could fight back? The anger began to eat him alive. It was becoming harder and harder to keep the weight of it from crushing him. It consumed him, tainted everything. His job, his friendships, his family life. Nothing felt right anymore. His thoughts were consumed by a single goal: to make Collins pay. But how? One afternoon, while pacing in his apartment, Jamal caught sight of his reflection in the window. He looked like a stranger. His face was gaunt, his skin pale from the lack of sleep. He looked like a man who was unraveling. How could he get his sister back? How could he undo what had been done? His body trembled as the realization hit him. He was spiraling. The anger, the grief, the confusion, it was all too much. He wanted to scream, but he didn't know who to scream at anymore. The faces that had once been comforting to him, those of his family, were now distant, like they were too far away for him to reach. He couldn't burden them with this, couldn't make them carry this pain with him. What was he supposed to do? His thoughts turned darker, deeper. He'd seen the news, heard the stories of people who fought back, who took justice into their own hands. But those stories weren't his, weren't real, were they? Could he really do something about this? Could he bring Brianna back by tearing down the world that had taken her? Jamal's hands shook as he gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. His mind raced through every possibility, every way to make this right. But it wasn't just about right or wrong anymore. It wasn't just about getting the justice that Brianna deserved. No. This had become something else. This was about vengeance, raw, primal, personal. He could feel it in his chest, a fire that was both his salvation and his damnation. He felt himself beginning to change. That Jamal he had been was slipping away, replaced by something else, something darker. The man who had once valued peace, who had dreamed of building a life with his family, was gone. And in his place stood a man whose soul was consumed by grief and rage. A man who saw only one way forward: to make Collins pay, to make the system feel the weight of what it had done. Desperation was growing. The thought of leaving things as they were, that was the real madness. How could he live with himself knowing that the man who had murdered his sister was still out there, still wearing that badge, still free to harm others? How could he face the mirror each day and pretend everything was okay, that justice would somehow find its way into the world? It wasn't going to happen. The world wasn't going to change for him. He had to make it change. The first step was simple: find Collins, and then make him feel everything Jamal felt: the weight of his sister's life, taken too soon, and the pain of a family that would never be the same. It was time to take control, to stop waiting for the world to deliver justice and deliver it himself. Jamal knew what he had to do. There was no going back. The path he was on now would lead him further away from the man he used to be, but he didn't care anymore. The man who wanted peace, who wanted justice through the system, he was gone. And in his place stood a man who would burn the world down to get what he needed. Revenge. He was already too far gone. Jamal spent the next few days trying to piece together the life of Mason Collins, the cop who had taken Brianna from him. He dug into the man's past, his career, his reputation, as though searching for some answer that could make sense of it all. But the more Jamal uncovered, the more tangled the web became. Collins had been a police officer for over a decade, and by all accounts, he was a decorated member of the force. He had earned accolades, built a reputation, and had the respect of many in the department. He was, in every way, a model officer. At least that's how he was perceived on the outside. Jamal knew better than to take the facade at face value. He wasn't naive. He had seen the signs, heard the rumors. There were whispers about Collins' behavior, about his tendency to lean into the kind of tough tactics that could easily turn violent. Word on the street, from the mouths of those who had seen it firsthand, painted a different picture of the officer. A picture of a man who saw his badge as a weapon, who used it to intimidate, humiliate, and control. But that was only part of the story. Collins wasn't a monster by nature. There were cracks in his exterior that Jamal could see, more subtle hints of a man who was struggling with something deeper than just his hate. It was easy to view him as an agent of evil, a faceless villain, in a system that had taken everything from Jamal. But as Jamal learned more, he began to realize that Collins wasn't just a man who had chosen to hurt others. He was a man trapped in the very system that was supposed to protect him. The more Jamal uncovered, the more Collins' vulnerability began to seep through. Collins had been raised in a broken home, a fact that was hidden beneath the polished surface of his professional persona. His father had been a cop too, a man who believed in harsh justice, in the law above all else. Collins had followed in his father's footsteps, not out of any deep calling for righteousness, but because it was all he knew. He had inherited a sense of duty that, over time, had morphed into a twisted form of loyalty to the system, a system that told him it was okay to silence voices, to wield power without accountability. He had learned that people like him, people in positions of authority, were always justified, always in control. Jamal could see how Collins had justified his actions. The cop had grown disillusioned with the world around him, his faith in the system eroding slowly with every case he had worked, every injustice he had witnessed. He had become numb to the suffering he caused, convinced that his actions, no matter how extreme, were a means to an end. The rules no longer applied to him. The line between right and wrong had blurred into something far more dangerous. A sense of entitlement, a belief that his badge made him infallible. And yet, there were moments where Jamal could sense the cracks in that facade. He had seen Collins' struggles in quiet, private moments, ones that only came to light after a little digging. There was the failed marriage to his high school sweetheart, a woman who had left him after years of emotional neglect and constant absences. Collins had tried to push her away with the same cold indifference he showed to the world, but deep down, he had wanted her to stay. His need to control, to dominate, wasn't just about power, it was about the fear of losing control, the fear of being weak. Jamal found himself torn. He wanted to hate Collins, wanted to see him as nothing more than the man who had ended his sister's life. He wanted to picture him as the monster he had become in his mind, a figure of pure evil who could be easily destroyed. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized that Collins was a product of a broken system, a system that had twisted him into something that didn't resemble the man he might have been had he been given the right circumstances. But that didn't make the pain any less real. It didn't bring Brianna back. The cracks in Collins' life didn't soften the edges of the anger Jamal felt every time he thought of his sister's lifeless body. Collins was still the one who had taken her, no matter the reasons behind his actions, no matter how broken he was. Jamal couldn't look at him and see anything other than the man who had stripped his sister of her future. As Jamal's investigation deepened, he also began to learn more about Collins' family, his wife, Monica, and their 2 children. Monica Collins was a woman who had once been full of warmth and optimism, but life with Mason had hardened her. She was a woman who had long ago accepted the distance between her and her husband, who had come to terms with the fact that the man she had married wasn't the man she had hoped for. They had built a life together, but it was a life forged in the ashes of compromise, of silent resentments and unspoken truths. Their children, a son and a daughter, were quiet, withdrawn, as if they too had been shaped by their father's coldness. Jamal couldn't help but wonder if they had been born into the same system that had corrupted their father. A system that had given him the power to destroy lives without ever having to face the consequences. He couldn't help but think that, in some ways, they were victims too, born into a family that valued control over compassion, obedience over understanding. But that didn't matter. No matter how much Jamal thought about Collins and his family, the fact remained that Brianna was dead, and nothing would bring her back. The pain, the sorrow, the overwhelming injustice, it was too much for Jamal to bear. He couldn't stop the swirling storm of anger inside him. The more he uncovered about Collins, the more his hatred grew. Collins wasn't just a man who had taken his sister. It was a representation of everything that was wrong with the world, with the system that allowed men like him to walk free while others suffered. Jamal understood now. This wasn't just about one man. It was about a broken system that allowed men like Mason Collins to exist, to thrive, while people like him, people like his sister, were left to pay the price. And while he might have once tried to see the good in people, tried to understand the complexities of their lives, Jamal knew that the time for understanding was over. The time for action had come. He would make them all pay. Collins, his family, the system that allowed them to live without consequence. Jamal knew that in order to truly get justice for Brianna, he would have to break everything down, tear the world apart until the pieces were scattered at his feet. And then, maybe, just maybe, he could find peace. But there was no peace to be found in vengeance. Jamal knew that too. And yet, the hunger for it, the fire that burned in his chest, was the only thing that kept him moving forward. Jamal sat in his apartment, the dim light of a single lamp casting shadows across the room. His fingers trembled as he gripped the cold metal of the gun, the weight of it unfamiliar but reassuring. It wasn't the first time he had held a weapon. He had grown up in a neighborhood where danger was never far, where survival sometimes meant knowing how to protect yourself. But this was different. This was the beginning of something that couldn't be undone, a choice that would define who he was from this moment on. He had spent the last few days pacing, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything other than Brianna. His mind kept returning to her face, to the terror in her eyes when she had begged for mercy, and to the hollow, lifeless stare of the body that had once been his sister. He had to make them pay. He had to make Mason Collins and his family understand. the pain they had caused him, and he would start with the weakest links, those who could be hurt without immediate consequence, those who had the misfortune of being connected to him. Jamal had studied them, the Collins family, their lives, their routines. He knew where Mason Collins' wife Monica worked, and he had learned enough about their children to know their vulnerabilities. The son, Nathan, had recently graduated from college, a kid with potential, or so it seemed, and then there was their daughter, Lisa, quiet, reserved, but still someone Jamal could use. She was the perfect starting point. His plan was simple at first. He would make them feel the loss that had been thrust upon him. He would take something from them, something that couldn't be replaced. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that pulsed through him like an electric current. This was it. This was the moment he could finally take control. But even as his mind was made up, something else twisted inside him, a nagging voice, a reminder that he was stepping into dangerous territory. The voice told him that revenge would not bring Brianna back. It told him that no matter what he did, he would never feel whole again. He would never undo what had been taken from him. But that voice grew quieter with each passing minute, drowned out by the image of Brianna's face, by the cold, calculating need to make them suffer as he had suffered. Jamal took a deep breath and set the gun down on the table. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface. He looked like a stranger. The man who had laughed with his sister, who had dreamed of a peaceful life, was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone who was willing to do anything, to get justice, to make sure the world understood the cost of taking what was his. He didn't have a plan beyond this initial step. He knew he was stepping into a world where consequences didn't follow predictable rules, but there was no turning back now. Brianna's death was not just an event. It was a wound that had carved through the very fabric of his life, and if he had to burn everything down to get even a fraction of it back, then that was what he would do. Jamal had already learned to keep his emotions in check. He had built his life on the quiet steadiness of his days, always just a little above the fray, always looking out for those around him. But now, he felt the weight of his own destruction pressing against him. Every choice, every moment of action, would pull him further away from the man he had been. He was becoming someone else, something else, and the cold emptiness of that transformation didn't scare him, it freed him. The next night, Jamal stood across the street from the Collins house, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the risks. He knew what would happen if he was caught, but it didn't matter anymore. His world was already gone, replaced by the need to see this through, to bring justice in a way the system would never allow. He had followed Nathan Collins for a few days, learning his routines, watching the way he moved through the world with a sense of entitlement that made Jamal's blood boil. The kid was no different than his father, just another cog in the machine that had stripped his sister of her life. But Jamal knew that Nathan wasn't the target. Not yet. He had to start somewhere, and Lacey Collins was the most vulnerable. Jamal had observed her at her job, a coffee shop in a nearby mall. She had long brown hair and an air of quiet defiance, the kind of person who always seemed to be thinking, but never saying much. She had a few friends, people who spoke about her like she was just another girl trying to find her way. She didn't deserve this. Jamal knew that, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered but making them feel the pain he had carried for days, for weeks, for a lifetime. The plan had been set. He had spent hours strategizing, waiting for the right moment. Tonight, when Lacey closed up the coffee shop, she would walk to her car, just like she did every other night, and Jamal would be there. He would make her understand, make her feel the weight of what her father had done. But even as he stood in the darkness, his heart began to beat faster, louder, until the sound almost drowned out his thoughts. He was no longer the man who had been shaken by grief and uncertainty. He was something else now, and he didn't know how much further he could go. How far could he push himself before he crossed the point of no return? The moment came faster than he expected. Jamal saw Lacey step out of the mall, her keys in hand, a quiet look on her face as she walked to her car. She was alone. She was the perfect target, the perfect opportunity to send a message. Jamal's hand trembled again as he gripped the gun tighter, but as he took a step forward, something inside him shifted. He hesitated for the first time since the moment Brianna had been taken from him. Jamal questioned himself. He questioned the path he had chosen, the steps he had taken. Was he truly making things right, or was he just becoming the same monster he had hated? Lacey's car door opened, and the world seemed to stop, but Jamal couldn't move. His heart thundered in his chest, and the weight of the decision fell upon him like a stone. For a moment he saw his sister's face in his mind, and then, in the darkness, he saw something else, the man he used to be. The man who had sworn to protect his family, not destroy it. Jamal stood frozen, caught between the rage that had driven him and the person he had once been. The gun lowered in his hand. This was not the way. This could never be the way. But the voice in his head still whispered, still urged him on, no matter what. There was no going back now. It was then, in that frozen moment, that Jamal understood something more important than vengeance. He understood the cost of losing himself in the pursuit of justice. The man who had walked into that alley was no longer the man who would walk out. Whether he took the first step toward revenge or not, he was already lost. The choice was his. But the man he had been was gone, and with him, the last shred of the life he had once known. Jamal's first taste of vengeance had left a bitter aftertaste, one that gnawed at his conscience. He had seen Lacey Collins, but he hadn't pulled the trigger. He hadn't been able to. Something inside him stopped him cold in his tracks, and for the first time in days, Jamal felt the weight of his actions pressing against him. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or fear or something deeper, but the hesitation stayed with him. The anger was still there, still consuming him. But there was something else, too, a nagging feeling that vengeance wasn't the path to peace. He wasn't sure where it had come from, but it made his stomach churn with uncertainty. It was an odd thing, to be caught between two worlds, the world of pain, anger, and rage that had taken root in him, and the world of the man he once was, the man who had been calm, collected, and steady, who believed in doing things the right way, even when it felt like the world was against him. But that man was gone now, replaced by someone who was willing to burn everything down for the sake of revenge. The resistance came sooner than Jamal expected. The moment he started taking steps to dismantle the Collins family, starting with small, calculated actions, like reaching out to Monica Collins at her place of work, setting up small scenarios to unsettle their lives, he began feeling the sharp edge of the system's pushback. It started with the law enforcement. Jamal had been careful, too careful, but the more he moved through the shadows, the more attention he attracted. As the bodies of the Collins extended family began to show signs of foul play, the whispers in the precinct grew louder. Police officers were trained to follow protocol, but the system they operated in had its cracks. It didn't take long for an investigation to be launched. Detectives, former colleagues of Mason Collins, started pulling threads, looking into every little detail, and Jamal was quickly becoming a suspect, though no one could quite connect the dots just yet. Jamal, however, hadn't anticipated the toll it would take. The closer he got to the Collins family, the more it felt like he was being pulled back into the chaos, the system that had torn him apart. The more power he tried to wield, the more he realized how fragile his own position had become. In the beginning, his thoughts were simple: take the family down, make them feel the pain he had felt, then maybe he would find some semblance of justice. But it wasn't that simple. His first major betrayal came from someone he thought he could trust: his cousin Marcus. Marcus had always been close to Jamal, his confidant through thick and thin. When Jamal started talking about taking action, about making the Collins family suffer, Marcus had listened quietly, never interrupting. But one night, after a few too many drinks, Marcus had changed his tone. He sat across from Jamal, the weight of his words heavy in the air. "Jamal, this isn't you," Marcus had said, his voice trembling with concern. "I know what happened to Brianna, and I get the anger, but you can't just go around hurting people because it feels good. You've got to think this through. The system's broken, I know that, but you can't be a part of it. You can't become like them." Jamal had shaken his head, the words sinking into his mind, but not breaking through. "You don't get it, Marcus. No one will do anything. No one cares. They're all complicit. Every single one of them, including you, is just waiting for someone to do something. While I'm doing it." Marcus had stood up, his face flushed with emotion. "No, you're not. You're just becoming a monster. This isn't justice. This is vengeance, and it'll destroy you." He had left then, storming out of Jamal's apartment, leaving behind a hole in the air where once there had been trust. That it wasn't just Marcus. His mother, too, had started to notice the changes in him. He'd become more distant, more consumed with his plans. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what to do. One night when Jamal came over for dinner, she asked him directly, "Jamal, I know you're hurting. I know this is all so wrong, but you've got to stop. This isn't the way. You're not the person who can bring justice this way. You're not that man anymore." His mother's words hit him like a slap across the face. He'd seen the fear in her eyes before, but now, it was clear. She was afraid of him. She was afraid of what he was becoming. Jamal felt his insides twist. The thought of losing his family, too, made his stomach churn. but he couldn't stop. He couldn't back down now that as the police investigation started to close in on him, the net tightened. Jamal's every move was scrutinized. Surveillance cameras, traces of his presence around the places where Colin's family members had been found. He had left enough of a trail for the police to start putting the pieces together. They were getting closer. But Jamal couldn't stop. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about finishing what he had started. His rage had become a weapon, and now it had a purpose. He was moving through the shadows, the threat of capture more real than ever. He felt detached from it all. The world was a haze of smoke and fire, and nothing could pull him from this course. The system, as he had always known it, was fighting back. There were roadblocks everywhere. La law, his family, his conscience pushed him in every direction, demanding that he stop. The faces of his mother, his cousin, and the people he had once cared for, people who had once kept him grounded, were starting to weigh on him. But it was too late. He had crossed a point of no return. The damage had been done. One night, as he prepared for the next step, another hit. Another loss for the Collins family. Jamal paused. He was sitting in his car, a few blocks from the Collins house, the engine running, but he couldn't make himself move. He was caught, frozen, in a moment of clarity. The weight of his decisions, of everything he had done, pressed against him like a wall. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as the realization hit him. What was he doing? What was the endgame? He wanted them to feel his pain. He wanted them to know the depth of his suffering. But what would be left of him when it was over? What would he have become? The question burned through him, cutting deeper than anything else. Jamal's mind raced. If he kept pushing forward, if he kept following through with his plan, he would be no different than the men who had killed his sister. He would be just another man who had used violence to solve his problems, another link in the chain of destruction that he had been trying to escape. But as the voices of his family and friends echoed in his mind, urging him to stop, Jamal's resolve hardened. He had already come too far. He couldn't turn back now. The system was broken. No one was going to do anything. This was the only way. His phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but when Jamal answered, the voice on the other end made his heart race. "We're on to you, Carter. You've made your move, and now you're going to pay for it. You're not getting away with this." It was the voice of a detective, someone he had once known, someone who had tried to protect him from the darkness that now consumed him. The system had started to fight back in earnest. But it was too late for Jamal. The walls were closing in, and he could hear the sound of chains rattling around him. Yet even as he felt the pressure mounting, there was one thing he was certain of. No matter what it took, no matter what it cost him, Mason Collins would pay, and the rest of the world would see that Jamal Carter's pain would not go unnoticed. At least, that was the only thing left to hold on to. The air felt heavy with tension as Jamal stood outside Mason Collins' house. It was the dead of night, and the street was eerily quiet. The usual hum of the city had been replaced by a silence that seemed almost suffocating. Jamal's heart thudded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the journey that had led him to this moment, the moment where everything would be decided. The weight of the gun in his hand was both a comfort and a curse. It had been his weapon, his tool of vengeance. He had used it to destroy everything Mason Collins held dear, the man who had taken his sister's life. But as Jamal approached the front door, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. The family was gone. His plan had succeeded. Monica and their children had been taken out one by one. Each death had been calculated, clean, and purposeful. But with each passing moment, the bloodshed had weighed on Jamal's conscience. The loss of the Collins family had been his doing. The screams, the terror in their eyes, had been his responsibility. And now, standing at the threshold of Mason Collins' home, Jamal knew that the cost of his vengeance was more than he had ever anticipated. He had been so consumed by grief, by rage, by the need to make them feel what he felt, that he had forgotten the simple truth. Revenge was never as clean as it seemed. It was never as just. And now, here he was, facing the man who had murdered his sister, the very embodiment of everything he had hated, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for the consequences. But it was too late to turn back now. Jamal knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. He didn't expect Mason to open it willingly. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsing every step, every word, every move. But nothing could have prepared him for the flood of emotions that hit him when the door swung open. There stood Mason Collins, his face haggard, his eyes wide with recognition. "You're the one," Collins said, his voice hollow, as if the realization was both a curse and a relief. He stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but Jamal was quicker. He raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Collins' chest. Don't, Jamal said, his voice steady but cold. I'm not here for a fight, I'm here to finish this. Colin's eyes flickered with something that Jamal couldn't quite place. Was it fear, regret, or was it just the instinctual response of a man facing his end? For a moment, the two men stood in the doorway, neither saying a word. It was as if the world had frozen around them, leaving them in this one moment of inevitability. You killed my sister, Jamal finally spoke, his voice low and strained. You murdered her, and I'm here to make you pay for it. Mason's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. You think this is justice? What you've done, what you've become? His voice cracked, but the anger that laced it was still evident. I didn't want this. You think I wanted to hurt anyone? I didn't, but that's the system we're in, Carter. I'm a product of it, just like you. And if you think this is going to make you feel better, you're wrong. Jamal's hand tightened around the gun, but something in Colin's words made him falter. For a brief second, he saw the cracks in the man standing before him, the man who had destroyed his world. Collins wasn't the monster Jamal had painted him to be in his mind. He wasn't some faceless villain who had done everything out of malice. He was a man broken by a system that had shaped him, that had twisted him into something he wasn't sure he even recognized. Jamal could see the pain in his eyes, the same pain he had felt after Brianna's death. Was it possible that Collins had been trapped just as much as he had? That the system, the same one that had taken Brianna, had swallowed him whole, turning him into a puppet of its cruelty? But none of that mattered now, did it? Jamal had been pushing this moment for so long, his entire existence focused on getting to this point, and now that he was here, standing in front of the man who had ruined his life, he didn't know what to do. He wasn't sure if he should pull the trigger or let it go. Was this what he had wanted? Was this the justice that would bring his sister back? Colin's voice broke through Jamal's thoughts. You don't know what you're doing, do you? You've become just like me, a man who uses power to get what he wants, no matter the cost. Jamal's stomach twisted at the words. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the truth, but it hit him like a blow to the chest. He had been so consumed by his own grief, his own sense of loss, that he hadn't realized how far he had fallen. He had become the very thing he hated. He had taken away a family, destroyed lives, all in the name of justice. But what kind of justice was this? What kind of man was he becoming? Do you feel better now, Jamal? Collins continued, his voice growing quieter. Do you feel like you've won, or have you just lost everything? For the first time since he had begun this quest for revenge, Jamal felt the weight of his own actions. It was all so much darker than he had ever imagined. He had thought that killing Collins, that watching the man die would bring some kind of closure, but it hadn't. All it had brought was more questions, more doubt. He was no longer sure of what he was doing, or why he was doing it. The gun shook in Jamal's hands, his vision blurred with the rush of conflicting emotions, anger, pain, confusion. He had been so sure of his path, so certain that revenge was the only way to find justice. But now, as he stood in front of Collins, he wasn't so sure anymore. Right, Jamal said, his voice shaking as the weight of his words settled in. I've lost myself, haven't I? Collins didn't answer. Instead, he lowered his eyes, as if ashamed of the man he had become. And then, in that brief moment of silence, Jamal made his decision. He couldn't kill Collins. He couldn't become the monster he had spent so long fighting. But he also couldn't walk away without facing the consequences of his actions. The gun in Jamal's hand lowered, and he dropped it to the floor with a soft thud. For a moment, he just stood there, his breath heavy in the silence. This wasn't the end he had envisioned, but it was the only one he could live with. I won't kill you, Jamal said quietly, his voice filled with a deep, overwhelming sorrow. But I won't stop either. The system will pay. You'll pay. Collins looked up at him, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem surprised. Perhaps, in that moment, he realized that the battle was never about him. It was about something, much bigger, something deeper than either of them. Jamal turned and walked away, leaving the house behind, the weight of his decision heavy on his heart. He wasn't sure where he was going, or what would happen next. But he knew one thing. The journey for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. The world had been shattered by grief, by vengeance, by a system that had failed everyone. And Jamal knew now that the only way forward was to fight for something more than just his sister's memory. It was to fight for the truth, for the people who had been silenced, for the justice that had been denied. And even if it cost him everything, he would keep moving forward, because that was the only thing left to do. The cost of his actions would follow him, but the cost of not acting was far greater, and Jamal Carter would never stop until the world felt the weight of his pain. Jamal stood at the edge of the rooftop, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes staring out at the skyline before him. The city stretched endlessly in front of him, the lights flickering like distant stars. He had once loved this view, this sense of belonging in a world that seemed too big to understand. But now, standing here, all he saw was emptiness. The quiet hum of the city, once soothing, now felt like a mockery of everything he had lost. It had been weeks since his confrontation with Mason Collins, and in those weeks, Jamal had done nothing but move through life like a ghost. He had not gone to the police with his confession, he had not sought any form of reconciliation. The decision to walk away from Collins, to spare him in that moment, had not brought the peace he had imagined. Instead, it had left him colder, emptier, questioning everything he had done, everything he had lost. He had avenged Brianna's death, he had made the Collins family feel his pain, but now, the victory felt hollow. That Jamal had never considered what came after vengeance. He had been so consumed by grief and anger, so focused on the moment of retribution, that he hadn't stopped to think about what it would cost him. The system that had failed him was just as broken as he had believed, but now, as he stood here, he realized that the cost of seeking justice outside the law was something far worse than he had imagined. He had lost his soul. In his quest to make the world feel his pain, Jamal had broken every part of himself. He had turned into the very thing he had despised, the thing he had fought against. His hands were stained with the blood of innocence, and no matter how much he tried to deny it, no matter how much he justified his actions, the truth remained. Revenge had consumed him. It had taken his peace, his future, and even the people he had once loved. There had been no joy in watching the Collins family fall, no satisfaction in seeing them suffer. Each life he had taken, each moment he had spent getting even, had only driven him further away from who he once was. He had thought vengeance would bring him closure, but it had done the opposite. It had pulled him into an abyss where nothing, not even the death of Mason Collins, could make him feel whole again. Jamal had been wrong. He could still hear his mother's voice, her warning echoing in his mind. This isn't you. This isn't the way. But the path he had taken had been too seductive. The desire to make them pay had drowned out every voice of reason, every plea for him to stop. And now, as he stood on the rooftop, the weight of his actions threatened to crush him. In the distance, a police siren wailed, its sound distant but undeniable. Jamal had been followed. The investigation had never stopped, never ceased to inch closer to him, and he knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before they found him, before his crimes, his actions, came back to haunt him. The law would eventually catch up to him, but that wasn't what haunted him the most. It was the faces of his family. The faces of the people he had once trusted, now distant and cold. Marcus had cut him off completely. His mother avoided him, and even his friends had begun to distance themselves. They could see what Jamal had become. They could see the toll that vengeance had taken on him, the broken man he was now. And as he looked out over the city, Jamal understood that it wasn't just the Collins family that he had destroyed. It had destroyed everything he had once loved. The thought of Brianna filled his mind again. He had started this journey for her, for the sister who had been taken from him too soon. He had fought so hard to make the world feel her loss, to make the people who had wronged him understand the depth of his pain. But now, as he remembered her smiling face, the warmth of her laughter, he realized that she would never be here again, no matter how much he sought justice. His vengeance had not brought her back. It had only taken him further from the person she would have wanted him to be. A deep, aching sorrow filled his chest as he thought about the last time they had spoken, the last time she had hugged him, told him everything would be okay. He had promised her that he would protect her, that he would keep her safe, and yet, he had failed her, not only in her death, but in the way he had let his grief turn him into a man he didn't recognize. In the pursuit of justice, he had abandoned his humanity. Brianna would have hated what he had become. The sirens grew louder, and Jamal knew he couldn't run anymore. He had tried to outrun his demons, but they had always been right behind him, waiting for him to face the consequences. The law would come for him, but in truth, Jamal had already sentenced himself. He had already lost everything worth fighting for. His mother's face flashed in his mind, and he could feel the sting of her disappointment, the sorrow in her eyes as she realized the man she had raised was gone. She had always wanted him to find peace, to rise above the hate and the pain. But Jamal had lost himself in the pursuit of something he could never reclaim. The sirens grew closer. Jamal stood at the edge of the rooftop, staring down at the city below, knowing that there was no escaping it. No matter what happened now, there was no going back. He had crossed the line, and there was nothing left for him but the consequences. In his pursuit of justice, he had sacrificed his own soul. The voice inside him, the one that had urged him on through all the bloodshed, had gone quiet. It was replaced by a deep, empty void, the kind of emptiness that could never be filled. He had done what he thought was right, but in the end, all he had was regret. There was no victory, no closure, only the hollow ache of knowing that vengeance had consumed him entirely. As the sound of the approaching police cars echoed in his ears, Jamal closed his eyes. Brianna's face appeared before him, her smile full of warmth and love. It was the last memory he would ever carry. He wasn't sure if he would survive what was coming, but in that moment he didn't care. The life he had known was gone. The man he had been was gone, and all that remained was a hollow shell of what once was. Justice, he had thought, would set him free. But all it had done was trap him in a cage of his own making.